Imagine standing in a vast desert landscape today. It feels endless, ancient, but tucked among the sand and rock are these incredible stone structures built by people who lived here thousands of years ago.
Mhm.
They stand silent, weathered, enduring. What stories, are these monuments trying to tell us about the lives they marked?
Well, they hold a powerful, sometimes really surprising story. These aren't just scattered rocks. They were deliberate constructions, markers on the landscape with pretty profound social meaning.
And that's exactly where we're going on this deep dive. We're looking at, 7,000 years of history in South Arabia?
That's right. Specifically focusing on these ancient monuments in the Dhofar region of Oman.
Okay. And our source material is some pretty remarkable new research, I understand.
Yeah, a sweeping study published recently that takes a truly holistic look. It analyzes 371 archaeological monuments found across this vast area.
Wow, 371 monuments. That's not just looking at one site, is it? It's using a massive data set to see the bigger picture, the patterns across time and space. So our mission today is really to unpack this study's findings. We want to understand how these monuments changed over these thousands of years, and crucially, what those changes reveal about the people who built them.
Right, the ancient pastoralists.
Yeah, specifically how they adapted their social lives, their connections, especially when facing these, dramatic environmental shifts.
And that's the core theme the study explores, how these communities maintained resilience as their world transformed. Particularly that huge shift from a, surprisingly humid environment to the hyper-arid desert we see there today.
A human environment in that part of Arabia.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But by looking at this sheer variety of monument types and their locations together, the researchers reveal this much larger, really connected story of adaptation.
Okay, let's unpack that story then, starting right at the beginning. We're talking way back, between 7,500 to 6,200 years ago.
Right.
And the landscape you might picture today in Oman, it wasn't like that back then.
Not at all. The study really highlights this era, the Holocene Humid Period. It was a time with significantly higher rainfall than today.
Higher rainfall. What did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, the sources describe an environment that could support standing water, mangroves.
Mangroves?
Yeah, mangroves, woodlands, grasslands, features almost unimaginable in the same place now. This allowed for a lifestyle centered around cattle herding, and it could support, larger groups of people.
Okay, so bigger communities, more resources, and the monuments from this early period, they seem to reflect that, don't they? That capacity for large-scale cooperation.
They really do. The earliest ones studied were these substantial structures called Neolithic platforms.
Neolithic platforms.
Yep.
And what were their characteristics?
Well, when the researchers looked closely, they noted they were clearly built by larger groups working at one time.
Ah, like a big community project.
Exactly. They call this episodal construction, basically, built in a single coordinated push. And they used massive stones.
How massive are we talking?
The study gives us this really vivid detail. The largest stones would have taken at least 7 strong men just to lift.
At least 7 strong men for one stone. I mean, that single detail tells you so much about the communal labor and coordination involved.
It really underscores the significant simultaneous labor involved. This indicates a capacity for large numbers of people to come together and work towards a common goal.
So these weren't just burial markers or something small scale?
No, the interpretation is that these platforms weren't just structures. They likely served as key sites for large gatherings. Think of times when multiple cattle herds, maybe belonging to different family groups, could converge for important events.
Like what kind of events?
Perhaps animal sacrifices, feasts, big social rituals, that kind of thing.
And where did they choose to build these massive communal platforms? Was the location significant?
Oh, definitely. Their location seems strategic for that kind of gathering. They often correlate with lower elevations, close proximity to springs, which would have been more reliable water sources back then, and these low topographic positions, things like small wadis or depressions.
So sheltered spots near water. Makes sense for bringing lots of people and animals together.
Exactly. These are precisely the kinds of resource-rich areas where larger numbers would naturally congregate in that wetter climate.
So, okay, let's try to visualize that for a moment. You need to forget the image of lonely ruins in a stark desert.
Right.
Picture instead a bustling community coming together, maybe after a good season, celebrating around this massive stone platform they've just built together in a landscape that's far greener, far wetter than it is today. It really paints a completely different picture of early life there.
It fundamentally changes our perspective on it. But as the study meticulously documents, that environment didn't last.
Right, here comes the big shift.
Yeah.
After about 6,000 years ago, the climate started to dry out.
Yeah, and this wasn't like flipping a switch. It was a process spanning millennia, eventually leading to the hyper-arid conditions we associate with the region now.
And it got really intense later on.
That's right. The aridification really intensified significantly around 2,700 years ago, putting immense pressure on that earlier way of life.
You can immediately see how that drying would force massive changes in how people lived. Fewer resources, less water.
Absolutely. As the region became increasingly arid, it just couldn't support those large gatherings anymore or sustain those large cattle herds as easily. People had to disperse.
Spread out across the landscape.
Yeah, spreading out to find scattered water sources and grazing land. This naturally led to smaller, more spread out social groups.
And presumably, different animals became more important.
Very likely. A necessary shift away from cattle, perhaps, towards animals better suited to the drought, like goats and eventually camels.
So how did their monument building change as their social structure and environment changed? Did they just stop building things?
They didn't stop, interestingly, but they adapted their monument technology quite significantly. The study focuses on the monuments from this transitional period, particularly Bronze Age tombs.
Bronze Age tombs, okay.
Specifically a type called high circular tombs, or HCTs. These were built roughly from 5,200 to 4,000 years ago.
And these HCTs, these tombs, are fundamentally different from those earlier massive platforms.
And several key ways that really seem to reflect the changing times. For one, these tombs involve significantly smaller total stone volumes, much less massive.
Okay, smaller scale. Easier for smaller groups to build.
That seems logical.
Yeah.
And while they were still generally built in one episode, which, makes sense for a burial event, the smaller stones clearly suggest smaller labor groups were involved.
Right.
But what's particularly striking, and I think speaks volumes about the adaptation, is their placement on the landscape.
Where did they start building these tombs then? Not near the springs anymore.
They appear in different kinds of locations, often in areas with higher fog densities, maybe seeking out any residual moisture areas with lower vegetation, and crucially, often on north-facing slopes and closer to the routes people traveled as they became more mobile.
Closer to travel routes.
Yes, but notice this. They are notably farther from springs.
Farther from the main water sources. Wow. That feels incredibly significant.
It really does.
It suggests maybe a deliberate move away from what might have become contested or, unreliable resources.
That's a strong possibility.
Yeah.
The move to smaller monuments, built by smaller groups, and their placement away from those shrinking critical resources near springs. It feels like a clear indicator of dispersal and adaptation.
So what was the social function then, if not large gatherings?
Well, the researchers propose that building these tombs became a crucial way to maintain social connections, precisely because those big face-to-face gatherings were less frequent or even possible.
Ah, so the monuments themselves become the connection point.
Kind of like touchstones, as this study puts it. They help consolidate a sense of being part of a larger society, even when people were physically distant much of the time.
So the dead, or the memorials to the dead, became these anchors or markers for the living community, helping them stay connected across distance.
That seems to be the idea. They may have helped forge social identities, maybe even mediate access to scattered resources through connections to memorialized ancestors.
Like staking a claim through lineage?
Potentially. The study suggests this period marks the beginnings of what they call genealogical time depth, effectively using these tombs to trace lineage and assert belonging, maybe even rights, in this changing, resource-scarce world.
And you mentioned their location on steeper slopes.
Yes, and that location on steeper terrain also aligns pretty well with areas suitable for herding goats, which were likely becoming more central to their survival in these drier conditions.
It really makes you consider how communities find new ways to weave their social fabric together when their traditional anchors, like abundant water and big gatherings, are gone. How these markers for the dead evolve into these critical social and identity markers for the living community. It's fascinating.
It's a powerful example of what you might call social resilience technology at work. And the story continues adapting further into even more arid periods.
Okay, so what happens next? What happens to the monuments as the environment becomes truly hyper-arid?
Well, later periods like the Iron Age, that's roughly 2300 to 1700 years ago, and then late antiquity, say 1100 to 750 years ago, you see further monument changes in this extremely dry environment.
And what characterizes the monuments from this era?
This era is characterized by what the study calls accretive monuments.
Accretive. What does that mean in this context? Like adding on over time?
Exactly. Think of monument types like triliths, often three-standing stones, quite simple, and also boat graves. Unlike the earlier types built in one go, these were built up over time. Sometimes across many years, maybe even generations, in what the study describes as repetitive visits rather than a single big construction episode.
So not a big community event like the platforms or even a single burial event like the tombs, but individuals or small groups adding their contribution over a long time.
Precisely. This seems like a truly flexible technology, perfectly suited for a dispersed population. People could come back to a significant place periodically.
And presumably these were less massive again?
Oh, definitely. They have significantly lower total stone volumes compared to even the Bronze Age tombs, and include very few, if any, heavy stones. This is completely consistent with construction by smaller, scattered groups, maybe just a family or a couple of people at a time.
Okay, and where were these accretive monuments built? Did the locations change again?
The placement is interesting and varies a bit. Triliths are often found in low topographic positions, like those wadis or depressions again, often with low fog or vegetation, but crucially, close to springs and the routes people traveled.
Back near springs and routes. Interesting.
Yeah, perhaps marking key points on networks. Boat graves appear a bit later, sometimes even reusing stone from abandoned settlements, and they tend to be in higher elevations with more fog or vegetation, often on south-facing slopes and in high topographic positions. So, different types for possibly different landscape uses or meanings.
Accretive building. It sounds like an incredibly ingenious adaptation for people living far apart. You can still contribute to a shared place, a shared memory, even if you only visit occasionally. You add your stone.
That's precisely the point the study makes. People would come to a monument and add their piece, literally building a memory and maintaining community connections, even with relatives or allies they might rarely see in person.
Could they convey information to?
Well, the monuments conveyed readable meanings, and the researchers speculate this could have even included practical environmental information valuable to pastoralists.
Like what?
Maybe a certain type of arrangement, or just the fact that someone had been there recently and added a stone might subtly convey something like, this is a place that received rain, or there's likely graves nearby. Information critical for survival in that kind of nomadic life.
Wow. Information literally built into the landscape for those who knew how to read it.
Yes, exactly. And their placement near routes and springs in these later periods really highlights their essential role in maintaining those crucial social networks.
Networks you'd absolutely need, right?
Absolutely. In a challenging desert environment, you rely heavily on these networks for survival, for things like exchanging livestock, finding marriage partners, obtaining rare materials that aren't available everywhere. These monuments helped anchor those networks.
And the study also noted that these later monuments often weren't built exactly where the oldest ones were. They weren't always layering on top of ancient sites.
That's another key insight. It suggests a dynamic social landscape. Communities use monuments not just to revisit ancient sacred centers, maybe, but also to mark and connect across wider, potentially new territories as they moved.
So it reflects their ongoing mobility.
Yes, it highlights this persistent commitment to mobile pastoralism as a way of life, even when conditions might have theoretically allowed for other strategies, like small-scale farming in certain microenvironments. The monuments helped stitch together this dispersed population across a constantly changing landscape.
It really highlights the ingenuity required just to maintain a sense of community over vast distances and through really difficult environmental times. How do you maintain that shared identity, that sense of belonging, when you live far apart and might meet infrequently? These innovative, incremental ways people built connections that could endure over time. It's quite something.
And that really brings us to the study's core synthesis, the big takeaway. This 7,000-year perspective on the monuments of South Arabia tells a truly remarkable story of social resilience.
Resilience in the face of this dramatic, long-term environmental change.
Exactly. The monuments weren't just static remnants. They were a dynamic, flexible technology that these ancient pastoralists continuously adapted and reinvented.
But their core purpose remained.
It seems so. The fundamental role they played as uh, touchstones for human social belonging, as the study calls it, remained constant, even as the climate became unrecognizable and the society itself transformed.
So resilience here wasn't about not changing, but about changing in adaptive ways.
Precisely. The pastoralists didn't necessarily abandon their entire way of life, like shifting en masse to large-scale agriculture everywhere. Instead, they showed incredible adaptive resilience by changing their social technology, the way they used monuments and the practices around them specifically to maintain those vital community networks.
And those networks were key to survival.
Essential for navigating and absorbing the risks inherent in a variable, drying desert environment.
And the real power of this particular study is that by analyzing hundreds of monuments across all these millennia, using a consistent method and modern techniques.
Right, things like satellite imagery analysis, GIS, quantitative analysis.
They could move beyond just looking at individual sites and actually reveal this overarching pattern, this link between social adaptation and the massive climate shifts.
It provides concrete empirical evidence for how communities can navigate profound environmental pressure while maintaining their core identity and social fabric over millennia. It's quite a story told in stone.
So, bringing it all together then, from the large, communally built platforms of a much wetter past, requiring those 7 strong men per stone, all the way to the dispersed, incrementally built markers of hyper-aridity where people added their own small piece over generations, these stones are really tracing the deep social pulse of ancient desert peoples.
Beautifully put. And the researchers suggest that this study, by showing how these ancient communities adapted their social structures, their connections, using monument technology in the face of such profound environmental change, well, it offers an empirical model.
An empirical model for assessing social resilience. That sounds like something with broader implications.
It certainly feels like it.
Oh.
They suggest this model could be applicable and adaptable to understanding how people in other challenging environments manage similar issues.
Like where?
Well, places like the Sahara, the vast steppes of Mongolia, or maybe the high Andes, other regions where people built and maintained communities across vast distances and through difficult environmental times.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Looking at these ancient stones and seeing how these communities built connection and identity, not just despite environmental change, but almost through adapting their social technology in response to it.
Yeah.
What can these deeply ingrained strategies of connection and adaptation teach us, about navigating the challenges, environmental and social, in our own world today?
That's the big question, isn't it?